Uh, I represent, I just give a brief background of myself. I represent indiatech.org, which is a voice for the startup ecosystem in India. Morning onwards, we have been hearing the word startup. I'll quickly take half a minute to explain what kind of startups I represent, because the word startup includes anything and everything that is started today across sectors. I represent what is called the consumer internet-based startups, which is a different animal from even the tech startups that we call, because you may have product startups, hardware startups, software startups, and services ones. Interestingly, huge amount of innovation happening in that sector that I see on ground. Some of them could be as simple as connecting the buyer and the seller on the ground, but most of it is enabling a new kind of innovation which is making life easier. So it does go to the previous sessions and the earlier sessions on ease of life. Yes, there is a lot of connectivity happening. People are leveraging the power of internet and innovating. And more importantly, they are also leveraging products in the hardware and software and services space to make it happen. So huge amount of innovation across sectors, whether it's pharma, whether it's healthcare, whether it's around enablement of services, household services, to even simple things like airline booking and cab hailing services and so on. So that's largely the ecosystem I represent. Again, contrary to the numbers, a huge amount of livelihoods getting created because of this enablement. What I say is when I walk into a startup in Bangalore or Hyderabad or Chennai or Delhi, I see both India and Bharat working there. When I say that, it means that you have the knowledge economy guys sitting and innovating. You have the feet on ground, which is Bharat delivering it on the ground. So, I mean, there is certainly, that is a glimpse of certainly an innovation. There's also a glimpse of entrepreneurship that is also building in the country with more and more founders. We had a fabulous session earlier where we saw young people innovating and creating their own kind of startups. So with that, before I get onto the question session, I am seeing a lot of innovation on ground in India, but I'm also seeing globally, and we have companies all around who are representing some of those innovative ideas. Certain things, of course, from my perspective, and this is more my perspective, is that we are governed by countries. We are societies that live inside countries, and innovation cuts across, technology cuts across, but there are times when technology and countries have to coexist, and that is where the disruption gets challenged in terms of policy. I saw an example of a tire which is called, I just wrote it down, it's called what? Airless non-pneumatic tires. There's a new thing that I've seen where there's no tubes, no air, nothing. You just roll it around. I was thinking about 60,000 petrol pumps and millions of the puncher guys in India who would lose their jobs if those tires come in. But, well, I mean, there is a graduated phase in which innovation gets adopted. So, I would start with Mark. From your perspective, what do you see as the role of policy in enabling innovation in the economy? I mean, from a let's assume that if you look at innovation, the typical thing would be that I give you a photo frame and tell you to innovate within that, you would give an innovation within that. But if I give you a room and say that build an innovation around it, then the regulation is one which I would draw around the room. So the innovation part precedes regulation, and regulation does a catching up. There is need for regulation, no doubt, but it should not kind of inhibit innovation, respect for laws, IPs, and a lot of other things that come with it. What's your take on that?
So, you know, every country has some differences in its resources, but what makes the greatest difference is how you employ your people, how you encourage their innovation, their creativity, because the one unlimited resource is the human mind, and people everywhere have innovative and creative capacity. There are no differences among people in that. There are only differences in the enabling environment. And so it's the job of the government to provide an appropriate enabling environment. That means education is important. That means tax and regulatory policies that at the very least stay out of the way of innovators and don't hamper them unnecessarily, but also encourages them. And finally, property rights, especially intellectual property rights, are the great incentive, but also the great way to protect people's investment. People don't invest in their creativity and innovation if they don't get a return on that. They will turn to other activities, but innovation is the one great activity that ensures your economy is most competitive. So strong intellectual property policies are key to that. Not necessarily strong, but effective, clear, and reliable and consistent are the most important elements to encouraging this kind of investment in intangible wealth.
Thanks, Mark. Turning on to Sumant, from your perspective, I mean, how critical, I mean, you represent a sector which is in the renewable space. How critical is innovation from your perspective, and where do you see policy enablement as something that can aid this sector in particular?
Yeah, thank you. So, you know, obviously, like every other sector, in our sector as well, innovation is very critical. Innovation, of course, in our sector can be of two types. There is the manufacturing side, where, you know, we're looking at the manufacturing of solar panels or wind turbines. And the second really is the execution side, where you actually talk about how these projects are actually built on the ground, what you can do to, in fact, make that execution more effective. And really, in some ways, a third part of it is how do you actually manage the entire grid in a way that you can absorb more and more intermittent renewable energy into the grid, and thereby increase the amount of percentage of renewables in the grid without necessarily causing huge investments to happen. So there are really, I would say, three different areas. You know, as a company, we tend to operate in the middle bucket, which is the execution side. And you know, obviously innovation is critical in our sector as well, as I said. The question is how well can you actually execute, how much can you get your cost of execution to come down, how can you actually decrease the timeline of execution. So there are many things that you can do in terms of project management, in terms of how you get the different pieces, the different components to work together that can actually allow you to become more efficient than somebody else, execute projects at a lower cost, or give a higher performance of the overall plan that you put up. Just to give you a simple example is the area of digital, which of course right now is becoming a big deal. In our sector also, our view is that digital can actually enable us to improve performance manyfold. And by manyfold, I mean obviously not multiple times, but certainly improve the percentage of, or decrease the percentage of downtime of our plants and improve the total generation. Now, if you can do those kinds of things, and thereby show that the capital that you put to work actually is able to give better returns than somebody else's capital, then immediately capital is actually going to start coming to you more than it is going to go to somebody else. And that then allows you to keep growing your business. And then, you know, you get to economies of scale and so on and so forth. So there are tremendous, tremendous advantages if you can actually execute projects in a better manner and then run your assets more efficiently and more effectively. And for all of that, the smartness with which you do it, I think is really very critical. I think the one other thing I would add, which is in the Indian context, which for me at least has been the biggest innovation in a sense, is very surprisingly in the area of corporate governance. You know, I operate in a sector which is an Indian infrastructure, where there has been a certain historical way of doing things. And when we started, we said that we're going to have absolutely clean corporate governance with the highest standards of ethics and the way we do our business. And it was not for any other reason, but really the sense of, you know, that is really the way we wanted to do things. And I found that over time, that led to, in a way, the biggest differentiation between us and our competitors, because in fact, it allowed investors to invest in us much more comfortably than in other companies. And, you know, to me that, you may call it innovation, you may just call it a way of doing things, but certainly I found that is, in fact, that has become the biggest differentiator in some ways between us and our competitors. So innovation, competitive advantage, differentiation, you know, can actually happen in a number of different areas, and you have to be alive to all those opportunities.
So from your perspective, if you look at India as a market for renewable energy, which is the aspect that you see has scope for innovation? Is it the efficiency side? Because the manufacturing side, certainly you do have, I mean, in case of solar, if you take, we are manufacturing crystalline panels, but thin film largely still comes from abroad. So from your perspective, do you see the process and the management side as innovation from an Indian perspective as of today?
Yeah, look, I think that if you just look at our sector, all the manufacturing of solar panels happens in China. We don't manufacture anything here, so there's very little scope for anything there. All the wind turbines, while they're manufactured in India, all the actual basic R&D happens in Europe, for the most part. And so therefore, none of that real innovation comes into the Indian context either. So really what we're left with is how to figure out how to really do these projects at the lowest cost possible. And the interesting thing is that despite not having control of the manufacturing side, in that sense, we are still able to actually put up projects in India at some of the lowest costs anywhere in the world. And that is when you normalize out for interest costs and so on, which are a little bit different. But, and the reason we're able to do that is because I would say that in India, we've kind of mastered the art of, in some ways, very low cost execution. Our people costs are low. The way we design allows us to, just do enough for Indian conditions and not to over-design. If we just were simply to import designs from other parts of the world, we'd probably end up with over-designed equipment. And so we've actually been able to localize the design quite considerably. And that has also allowed us to bring costs down quite substantially. And so therefore that has really allowed us to get costs of renewables down, to levels which are the lowest in the world actually at this point in time.
So turning on to Kate, from your perspective, where do you see and this is a sector that you represent, which India has a huge manufacturing base. If you look at where India manufactures and where India innovates in this sector, it is more collaborative in a sense that India happens to be, I would say, partly a back office for the world manufacturing on pharma. On the other side, it is also innovating and manufacturing certain types of drugs, which are more local but can be taken abroad. And then, of course, you have the big pharma globally, which is collaborating in India and also manufacturing in India. From your perspective, I mean, this is a sector that constantly innovates, primarily because we have humans and we are prone to diseases, we are prone to different attacks, and we self-inflict a lot of things thanks to the lifestyle we lead in. And this sector constantly innovates for that. So from your perspective, where do you see innovation, and what's the, I mean, apart from, of course, the trigger for innovation, where do you see innovation moving in which direction? Because this is a sector which possibly may be innovating 10, 20 years ahead of time. And at the same time, you have your trials and things that come in. Where do you see this moving from a sectoral perspective? And where do you see a role for India and enabling policies for this particular sector?
Great, thank you for the question. As you mentioned, the pharmaceutical sector is real bedrock is innovation because of human activity due to environmental activities and just the broad disease burden around the world. It's ever shifting. We could even cite just a few years back the evolution of Ebola and the fact that there was no cure when it started to spread in West Africa. However, one of pharma's member companies, Merck MSD, had made billions of dollars of R&D and investment in that disease sector. And thankfully, through a partnership with the US government, they were able to take that final work and take it over the finish line to find a cure and a vaccine. So the evolution broadly for the industry is ever evolving. And I think India is well positioned, as mentioned, in the generic industry as the pharmacy of the world on the broader landscape and really the basics of medicine. However, we do need to be thinking about the future. And pharma, we represent the 35 innovative world leaders, American, European, and Japanese companies. And we see India as real potential for that innovative space. However, the key underpinnings to move that forward is the policy environment. And where I see the opportunities on the policy space are twofold. First and foremost, in the intellectual property space, as mentioned by Mark, allowing for innovators to innovate here in India and to protect their inventions, to ultimately commercialize those and address patient needs, but then also on the regulatory space. There is a lot of activity taking place on the regulatory global stage, and one example is the International Council on Harmonization. This is a global body where India has just shown up in the month of June of this year. India has been an observer, but India is now on the path to become a full member, and that will take 2 years. But India needs to sit at the table to play a global role and showcase the great work that is taking place, but ultimately to move forward into the innovative space.
Thanks, Kate. I do have Satya as well, who represents the same industry, and I'd like to hear your views on, from an India standpoint, where do you see innovation taking off in this particular sector, and are you looking at policy enablement, which hasn't happened yet or is in the works, something that can also possibly create, like Kate was mentioning, I mean, they do represent a large chunk of innovative pharma companies. So where do you see this happening?
Innovation is very resource consuming and time consuming, and it is not sustainable. And unless we start accepting failures in the society, in the institutions, you can't nurture innovation. So I'll give a simple example. If a young entrepreneur comes with an idea and he fails in commercializing the idea, how many institutions, both financial and government institutions, will support his fourth idea, which is very fantastic? See, in India, we have risk. We don't have risk capital. So government and institutions should support creating a fund to fund risky innovations. Where people are talking disruptive innovations. All disruptive innovations will not fructify and give success. So we should create a lot of environment and ecosystem to accept failures. So failures are a stepping stone for success. So we don't have that kind of culture. So we need to create a culture accepting failures in the society. Failed entrepreneurs. Is there any bank who will come up with funding for a failed entrepreneur who will come up with a nice idea? It's not. We don't have that kind of culture or society created. Whereas you go to Western societies, they can bankrupt 10 companies and he comes up with the 11th idea which is brilliant, you get funding. But we don't have that kind of culture. So we need to create risk capital to support innovation. That's the big policy change our government should think.
One of the things that years back when I was visiting multiple labs around the world which were engaged in high-tech innovation, I did ask a couple of global CEOs on, and these were companies which had crossed 100 plus years in existence, on what was the secret of living through being a technology company, living through 100 years, because technology goes obsolete immediately. And the answer was that we reinvested huge amounts into innovation. And every decade we had a new competitor. And every decade, so when the next question was, how many competitors do you have? They said, which decade are you talking about? So which means that they had one competitor every decade. But what made them survive was the fact that they not only innovated, they productized, they marketed, and then they monetized on it. So that aspect is pretty critical. And I was having a chat with some of the conventional businesses in India a few weeks back. And this is a fundamental thing, which is all of us get bright ideas. And all of us think we are scientists, right? I mean, why can't somebody do this? And all of us get the idea. Ideas lead to innovation when you work on it. And innovation is a lab issue. I mean, I might create a prototype, but that prototype has to be innovated to build into a factory environment. And then you need innovators more to productize this product by building what would go into the manufacturing line. And then you need more innovators to efficiently market and create the want for the product, and then monetize the product by selling it. That's how the whole innovation chain runs. So innovation here, when we talk, is not restricted to just inventing something. It's the whole walk, the talk till the end. when it lands in the hands of the consumer and the consumer continues to want more and continues to want more innovative products which build on as his tastes change. So that's the entire journey. And therefore, from that perspective, turning on to Patrick, what's your view? I mean, globally, do you see governments as a policy looking at innovation, promoting innovation as such?
So, a great question. I think we see governments still crafting policy towards yesterday's economy. And here's what I mean by that. We think about the trade agreements that have been put in place over the last 70 years at the national level, at the multilateral level. They were all about the movement of goods. You know, so we created rules to facilitate the movement of goods. In our countries, we built infrastructure, roads, airports, shipping ports. Then we, saw, okay, services economy. We started to shift towards rules that facilitated services. We built ICT infrastructure. But today, the real greenfield is the knowledge economy. And we haven't yet, on a broad basis, put in effect the rules that will facilitate trade in ideas. And that's the intellectual property rules that Kate and Mark talked about. It's the rules that allow the fungibility of money that my other colleagues talked about, the allocation of risk capital to risk-taking activity. We're in an economy, a functioning market where money is fungible, investment's going to flow towards where investors get a return on investment commensurate with risk. In those innovative and creative sectors, the bar is higher. And if there are, if you're imposing on top of the usual business risk, the technical risks of doing something innovative, an additional political risk that the government may not respect your property rights, especially retrospectively, then that investment capital is going to flow elsewhere. So the trick really is, if we want to succeed in the knowledge economy, we've got to put in place the infrastructure for a knowledge economy.
And this is a question for all the panelists, and this is purely because the whole exercise is also to get something out of this session, apart from, of course, hearing innovative ideas and the challenges that exist, is if for your sector, speaking for your sector, if you were asked a question on what is that one enabling policy that makes a huge difference for your sector, and if you can, name one country which is a dream country for you to be in, and this is an outside India question, so India doesn't qualify to be in this debate, and I'm keeping the controversy out here. One particular policy that you feel is a big enabler for your sector or set of sectors, and more importantly, it need not be a financial one. The fundamental logic on which, the premise on which largely companies do tend to go is that I'm getting land, I'm getting things free, but obviously there has to be an enabling environment of a policy that doesn't question you on day one when you innovate, saying, sorry, this is illegal or this is illegitimate. And of course the fact that you do have a scenario where you would be kind of complimented by one part of the government and arrested by the other part of the government for having innovated something. So obviously you do have those challenges in innovation. From that perspective, if you were asked one enabling policy that you expect for any of the sectors, I mean for folks representing your sectors, you can speak for it, but for others I would leave it to, being generic, the more the merrier from your end.
For enabling innovation or just in general?
Anything that enables innovation and anything that brings out something that can take your sector to the next level. Something that any country has done. It need not be an India example, as I said. Let's assume, like you mentioned, that Europe did innovation in the wind space. Solar may be some other country, but something may have propelled that there, right? Apart from, of course, people's own enterprise and people's own innovative capability, there must have been something that would have enabled.
Well, in our sector, it's such a basic sector, and there are such basic things that need to be done, that we don't even need anything very high-flying or any, great cutting-edge innovation. We really need some very, very basic things to get fixed. In the power sector in India, unfortunately, it's one sector that the whole reform process has just left behind. And I can speak on it for quite a long time. We have only 5 minutes left. So I'm not going to. Sorry, the point is, the one thing I would say is that, our distribution companies are in very, very poor shape. Simply because our politicians price power. And so if there's one policy I would have to come up with, I would take away the ability of our politicians to price power and use it as a political gimmick or as a political way for them to get votes. I think if that's the one thing that they could do, then the whole sector would just take off in a very totally different direction.
I'll give you an anecdote about about American literature. In the 1800s, when U.S. first implemented copyright law, they provided it to American writers, but not to foreign writers. And as a result, American books were very expensive, and the European, some of the finest literature, in Europe would come in very cheap because they were stealing it. As a result, American literature languished, and everybody bought European novels. Well, as soon as the United States said, okay, let's honor the copyright of European authors, American literature started to take off.
Great. Well, I'm going to speak about a U.S. policy that I think is an example that could unleash a lot of innovation here in India, but then also a recommendation for Indian policymakers to look at a policy that could help, again, unleash innovation. So I would say the lesson learned took place about 40 years ago in the United States, and it was through the Bayh-Dole Act, also known as the Patent and Trademark Act, where it really incentivized innovation at the academic level. And we just sat before us and saw those 17 and 19-year-olds talk about these incredible ideas and innovative ways of approaching real health needs and development needs. So I think that would help unlock innovation through the academic setting and also in the next generation here in India. So something to look at. But in terms of our sector and an integral policy change, I'd look to the Patents Act and specifically Section 3D. In Section 3D, we feel as though there needs to be a recognition and a value for incremental innovation, talking about that disease burden that we talked about before. Unfortunately, here in India, there is a strain of TB that's drug resistant. And this is a big evolving problem. And there are innovative drugs. However, we need to be able to value them and also help enable more inventions and cures to take place here in India.
Interestingly, US is the great example of industry-academia collaboration, where universities are becoming budding centers of startups and innovation. And as Kate mentioning, so one size doesn't fit all. So India Section 3D is a great example for all emerging economies, not to promote evergreening of patents. That is one, many emerging economies definitely look towards India to protect countries' interest, broader interest, not individual interest. So we feel 3D is a great protection, not to evergreen patents. Yeah.
So with respect to intellectual property protection, the type of intellectual property protection most relied upon by businesses, more than patents, more than copyrights or trademarks, is trade secrets, the protection of confidential business information. And this is also particularly important to small and medium enterprises because this is the most affordable form of protection. It's important to large enterprises because you use this protection to protect the R&D that eventually results in patents and commercialized inventions. And this is the kind of protection that has been important in the US, and the protection has been made more effective over the years in Japan, Korea, Taiwan. As countries emerged and became more competitive and innovative, they protected it. So the thing I would recommend for India is a codification of its trade secret law in order to make it more effective and reliable for small businesses. This is something when I did a workshop with the Indian government and US government, these small and medium enterprises present all said they wanted this. I think it would be a great policy initiative.
Thanks. So from protection to trade secret law to innovation cutting across layers, cutting across societies, cutting across countries, to customizing something that's necessary for India. We have had a good range of discussion around. Unfortunately, I see time up, so we'll have to come to a conclusion of this session, but I hope the deliberations are useful for... you said time up there. Okay, so happy to open for questions, just 2 of them. Any questions? Yes. Can we have the mic there?
Hello. You were talking about protection for small and medium industries. Right? See, there are 2 classes of protection. One is the law, and the second is the ability to enforce contracts. Okay, so you have 2 problems here, right? Okay, the ability to enforce contracts, where the law is okay, it's codified. That's the second problem. We are unable to enforce contracts. That becomes a huge problem in companies, you know. So you're only able to work with people you trust.
Absolutely. It's an excellent comment, and I think I don't have anything to add. You need an effective judicial system that enforces people's rights.
Just one question, and it is like when the policy makers or the policy itself becomes a gateway for the entry of innovation, like for different countries. So I'll not put disclaimers, just that the policymaker becomes a gateway that you should be innovating only in this direction and not in the other direction. Driverless cars could be one example, or driverless tractors also. So we have our reasons, but what to do when the policymaker become the gateway, what should be innovated or not?
One of the great things about property rights, including intellectual property rights, is they push those decisions down to the market participants, the people with the best information and the most incentive to make those decisions. So yes, you push the risk as well as the benefit down to individuals through property rights, including intellectual property rights.
Yeah, maybe I could just add a thought to that, which is, you know, government does have a role in guiding innovation towards strategic priorities, you know, military, social, health, and it can do that through funding of, you know, basic science, R&D. But when government tries to dictate outcomes, then you lose the basic benefit of private sector activity, which is the dynamism and innovativeness that, you know, they're going to find a solution that you didn't think of.
Yeah, and to your point on government driving innovation, I gave you the example of a picture frame, and I said if the government defined and said this is the size of the frame, innovate within it, that's the size of innovation you will get. In cases you may have in different contexts, in different countries and different sectors, where the regulation may have already been written, and you may have been forced to innovate within that. That's when you need to do advocacy and lobby with the government to ensure that the government sees a larger scheme of things as to why they need to take a liberalized view of the whole policy and make it more open. In some other cases, you may not have a policy in place. You're free to innovate, and the government may come back and say, sorry, you infringe on the following, which may be of national security concern or a sensitivity around the way culturally the country runs or is governed. That is when, obviously, then that is where the conflict happens between the disruption and the regulation. And obviously, the mid ground is found in course of time.
In the health sector, the innovations are so rapid. I think governments will also look into ethical innovation as well. So if you look at genetic engineering coupled with artificial intelligence and all, the progress could be enormous. And as you have seen, people could have designer babies, and death could be optional by 2045. So people will have more moral and ethical obligations when it comes to the healthcare innovations in the future. So government will also come up with the regulations to promote or restrict the usage of genetic engineering coupled with data mining and all.
Thanks. With that, we come to an end. That's interesting quote, death being optional in course of time with innovation. I'm not sure how much of us will be comfortable taking that, but certainly the youngsters would. So with that, we come to an end of this session. Thanks.
I would